Do you know what happens when a truth threatens an entire civilization? When an idea, a discovery, a simple fact, does not simply call into question a detail, but the entire architecture of a collective narrative. History teaches us this tirelessly. The truth is almost never rejected because it lacks evidence. It is rejected because its consequences are too heavy to bear. Take Galileo. He observes the sky. He sees something that nobody wants to see. He dares to tell her. Result? Fierce opposition, trial, conviction. It will take centuries for his name to be rehabilitated. Then Darwin. He is not trying to provoke anyone. He assembles facts. He proposes a theory, scandal, moral rejection, institutional hostility. And yet, today, this theory structures our understanding of living things, or even Champollion. Faced with hieroglyphs, he does not see mystical symbols. He sees a tongue, a logical approach. He deciphers it. We doubt him. On minimize, we resist. And then, suddenly, all of ancient Egypt found its voice again. The same pattern every time. He saw something. He said it. They tried to silence him. For what? Because the truth, when it emerges, never simply adds a line to a book. It requires rewriting entire chapters. The mechanism is always the same. Only the truth changes its face. And this mechanism, he never stopped. It still works today, in more subtle forms, more academic, more polite, but just as effective. Because over the past few decades, something discreet but deeply disturbing has happened. Between the 1970s and the 2000s, in respected Western universities, within archaeological missions conducted in the Middle East, researchers have begun to notice anomalies. Archaeologists, epigraphers, specialists in ancient manuscripts, historians of religions, people who had nothing to gain from provoking, and everything to lose by being wrong. They were not driven by an ideology, but through a method, that of modern archaeology, stones, registrations, dating, material facts. And what these facts seemed to indicate was disturbing, not spectacular, not sensational, but deeply uncomfortable, because these discoveries did not contradict the faith. They did not attack believers. They were calling into question something far more sensitive, certain established narratives. The way a story had been told, fixed, then transmitted as intangible. He was history, power, official narrative. When these four elements intersect, the truth immediately becomes political. And it is precisely at this point that archaeology ceases to be a science of the past, to become an investigation into the present. If you are still here, it's because you're one of those who prefer to understand rather than repeat. Subscribe, and let us continue together this investigation that few dare to carry through to the end. Because what I am about to tell you is neither an attack nor a provocation. It's an exploration, spring, documented, rigorous, an investigation where every claim is based on sources, where every doubt is methodically constructed, and above all, an investigation that deeply respects faith while questioning the narratives produced by men. Because there is a fundamental difference between believing and accept without ever examining it. And that's where the story gets interesting. But to understand why this truth is so disturbing, why does it still provoke awkward silences and hushed debates today? First, you need to look carefully. That's what we've always been told. For centuries, the origin of Islam and its founding texts has been presented as a clear narrative, consistent, almost perfectly linear. A story that many are familiar with. That which is taught. Let us repeat. According to this commonly accepted version, The revelation took place in the 7th century, in the Arabian Peninsula. The message is initially transmitted orally, memorized, recited. Then a few decades later, it is fixed in writing. The text is compiled, standardized, stabilized. A clear chronology, a logical sequence of events, an apparent consensus. In this context, the beginnings of Islam are presented as exceptionally well documented. Compared to other, older religious traditions, everything seems to be in its place. And this sense of clarity rests on a powerful institutional framework. Religious institutions, first of all. Guardians of tradition. Authorized interpreters of the text. Responsible for the transmission of spiritual, but also historical knowledge. Then the universities. Departments of Islamic studies. Chairs of history. Academic textbooks. Structured knowledge. Codified, validated by generations of researchers who, for the most part, work within this narrative framework. And finally, the states. Through education, through school curricula, through cultural diplomacy. Because the history of a religion is never just a matter of faith. It touches on identity, to legitimacy, with symbolic power. Thus, a stable narrative is formed, solid in appearance. But as is often the case in history, stability is not always synonymous with complete truth. Because when we deviate from the transmitted texts to turn to material traces, some cracks are starting to appear. First, there are dating problems. Some manuscripts are attributed to very early period seem, after scientific analysis, a little later than expected. Nothing spectacular, a few decades sometimes. But in history, a few decades can change everything. Then, silences. Entire periods are surprisingly poor in contemporary sources. Major events mentioned only in retrospect. Detailed accounts, but written long after the alleged events. And then there are these even more troubling discrepancies among certain reported traditions and what ancient inscriptions reveal. Between the story transmitted and what the coins show, graffiti, architectural remains. These elements do not scream. They are not arguing. They are content simply to exist. It is precisely at this stage that new players enter the scene. Archaeologists, accustomed to working with the silence of the ground rather than with the certainties of texts. Philologists, obsessed with every linguistic variation, each unusual word, each formula that seems anachronistic. Epigraphers, who spend their lives deciphering a few lines engraved in stone and to place them back in their exact context. What do they have in common? They do not begin with a conclusion. They begin with a method. Compare, date, to contextualize. They cross-reference the sources. They are testing the hypotheses. They doubt by profession. And very often, their work remains confined to specialized journals, far from the general public, far from the heated debates, because what they are observing is not yet a direct challenge. It's something more subtle. A vague impression that the official narrative, however coherent it may be, could be the result of a more complex historical process, more gradual, more humane. Officially, everything is clear. But on the field, sometimes stones tell a different story. A fragmented story, incomplete, but persistent. And when enough clues point in the same direction, the historian can no longer look away. That's precisely it, that the investigation truly begins. From that moment on, history ceases to be a transmitted narrative and becomes an investigation. Because when storytelling meets matter, it is no longer the words that speak first, but the evidence. Evidence that does not seek to convince. They are here, silent, indifferent to beliefs. This is how modern archaeology works. She doesn't ask the question, "What should we find?" She asks, "What are we actually finding?" The first weapon in this investigation. This is carbon-14 dating, a cold method, mathematical, implacable. She is not interested in traditions, nor to interpretations. It measures the disintegration of an isotope, and she answers only one question. When did this object cease to be alive? Applied to parchments, to fragments of manuscripts, to the organic supports of ancient texts, it allows us to establish a time range, not an exact date, but a credible time frame. And sometimes, this period does not correspond exactly to the one that the official narrative expects. Next comes epigraphy, the study of inscriptions carved in stone, fixed words, audiences, intended to be seen by everyone. Unlike religious texts that were transmitted and copied, an inscription cannot be easily corrected. It is posed within a specific context, at a specific location, at a specific moment. Then paleography, the art of recognizing an era in the shape of a letter, an angle, a curve, a way of writing a dot or a line. Details invisible to the untrained eye, but obvious to the trained eye. Finally, numismatics, currencies, objects of power, objects of circulation, propaganda materials. A coin always carries a message, a name, a symbol, a language, and above all, an issuing authority. When these four methods are combined, they produce something formidable, a chronology independent of the narrative. This is how the first disturbing discoveries emerged. Ancient inscriptions bearing religious formulas, but without certain elements that one would expect to find. Fragmentary manuscripts attributed to a very early period, but whose writing suggests an already advanced stage of development. Coins circulating in key regions where certain names, certain titles, or certain expressions do not appear yet. What is striking? That is not what is present. That's what's missing. Absence is never proof in itself, but when it is repeated, it becomes a question. Why is this central term not attested earlier? Why do certain formulas appear gradually? Why does standardization seem to be coming so late? These questions do not arise in public conferences. They emerge in archives, silent rooms, dusty boxes that have never been opened for decades. In the margins of old publications, notes are sometimes found. Question marks, careful phrasing, formulations such as uncertain dating, problematic attribution, hypothesis to be reevaluated. Nothing spectacular, but an accumulation. And some of these discoveries, when they do not easily integrate into the dominant framework, are simply set aside, not censored, not prohibited, simply minimized, published in journals with limited circulation, mentioned in a footnote, never included in general summaries. This is how science often works, not through conspiracy, but by inertia. Because questioning a chronology, this is not about correcting a minor detail. It's about shifting an entire intellectual framework. Then comes a pivotal moment. A moment where several clues converge. Different manuscripts, different regions, different media. And yet, the same discrepancy appears. Not huge, not revolutionary at first glance, but significant. An impression that the written fixation, text, standardization, and doctrinal structuring took longer than the simplified narrative suggests. This does not negate the founding event. This does not negate faith. But this raises a fundamental question. What if history had been more progressive, more spread out, more humane? At this stage, No serious researcher draws a definitive conclusion. They do what the method requires. They have doubts. They check. They are still comparing. They know that a premature revelation can destroy a career, so they advance cautiously. But one thing is now clear. The time lag is not accidental. It is a recurring issue. And when the same phenomenon appears in different disciplines, within independent contexts, the historian can no longer speak of coincidence. The narrative is beginning to unravel, gently, silently, but irreversibly. And it was at that precise moment that the nature of the investigation changes. Because what was an academic curiosity becomes a major historical question. But here's the thing. This was only the beginning. The more researchers progress, one thing becomes clearer. What they are observing is not an isolated anomaly. This is not a poorly dated manuscript, nor an ambiguous inscription, nor a poorly preserved piece. That's a pattern. Because the discoveries are starting to respond to each other. Different sites, sometimes separated by hundreds of kilometers. Entire regions of the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, Mesopotamia. And yet, the same discrepancies appear. Always discrete, always technical, but strangely consistent. When an archaeologist compares his notes with those of a colleague, when an epigrapher compares his inscriptions with manuscripts studied elsewhere, a feeling of unease sets in. They are not looking for the same thing. They don't work with the same materials. They do not use the same methods. And yet, they run up against the same gray areas. This consistency is disturbing. In science, errors are rarely synchronized. The contradictions, on the other hand, can be. Gradually, attention is focused on the written sources themselves. The chronicles, traditional stories, old biographies. When read side by side, without isolating them, some tensions are emerging. Major events described with astonishing precision, but written several generations after the events. Details that vary, dates that keep slipping, characters who gain importance over time. Nothing scandalous in itself. All religious traditions experience this phenomenon. But here, the contrast with the material traces becomes difficult to ignore. Between oral traditions transcribed later and what the oldest inscriptions reveal, a gap is emerging. Between structured theological narratives and the first epigraphic mentions, the vocabulary is not always the same. Some concepts seem to be missing at the outset, then gradually appear, not as a breakup, but as an evolution. In addition to this, there are contradictions between periods. What is presented as a homogeneous set, it seems, upon examination, having gone through several phases of consolidation, adjustment phases, two clarifications, standardization. In other words, a living history. But this complexity poses a problem because the dominant narrative is based on an impression of early fixity. And to question this fixity, it's not just about discussing ancient history. It touches on the way in which an identity has been constructed. This is where institutional reactions become noticeable. They do not take the form of outright bans. There is no trial, no index, no official condemnations. There is something more subtle. Silence. Submitted articles, then left without a response for months. Delayed research projects. Funding redirected. Conferences where certain presentations are scheduled, then discreetly moved to secondary sessions. Published works, but never cited, never discussed head-on, as if they didn't really exist. This is not a conspiracy. It's a collective inertia. Because recognizing that there is a structural problem, this is to acknowledge that entire generations of syntheses must be reassessed. And that takes time, intellectual courage, and sometimes a certain degree of discomfort. For universities, this means rewriting programs. For religious institutions, this means explaining the nuance without undermining faith. For the states, this means accepting a less simple story, less politically mobilizable. So, the system resists, not out of malice, but through self-preservation. And yet, the evidence continues to mount. Each new registration published fits into the same pattern. Each manuscript analyzed adds a piece to the puzzle. Each unearthed coin confirms that certain symbols, certain titles, some names have gradually become established. At this stage, it becomes difficult to talk about an isolated error. It's difficult to talk about chance. What is emerging? It is a complex historical process made up of developments, adjustments, and successive constructions. A human story. And that is precisely what makes her sensitive. Because it's a human story does not call into question the spiritual message, but she challenges the idea that everything would have been frozen instantly, without debate, without transition, without context. The more researchers become aware of this dynamic, the more they consider the implications. What they hold in their hands is no longer a simple academic discussion. It's a key that opens up questions that many would prefer not to ask. At this stage, the investigation can no longer be reversed, because ignoring these contradictions would now be a decision, and no longer a methodological precaution. And that's where things get really sensitive. It happens in any serious historical investigation, a special moment. A moment when the accumulation of details ceases to be a backdrop and becomes a breaking point. So far, the researchers could still talk about nuances, of complexity, gray areas. But at a precise moment, a discovery changes the very nature of the question. This moment, for the archaeology of early Islam, does not take the form of a spectacular event. No thunderous announcement, no press conference, just a manuscript, or rather, a collection of fragments, old pages, preserved, studied, sometimes forgotten in university collections. They do not come from a single place, but when you put them together, they form a corpus. And this corpus, subjected to modern dating methods, produces a disturbing result. Carbon-14 dating is conclusive. The time frame is clear, stable, confirmed by several independent laboratories. These fragments are old, very old, but not exactly as expected. They don't match perfectly to the simplified chronology that is taught. Not late enough to be secondary, not early enough to be immediately foundational. They occupy a middle ground. And this in-between changes everything. Because when researchers analyze the text itself, other elements appear. Language, first of all. She is recognizable, but it is not yet completely stable. Some formulas vary. Some grammatical structures are inconsistent. We observe lexical choices, which will only be standardized later. To the untrained eye, these details seem insignificant. But for a philologist, they are decisive. They indicate a transition phase, a moment when the text exists, circulates, but is not yet fixed in its canonical form. Then comes the paleographic analysis, writing. The letters are not yet standardized. Some roots coexist. Some agreements have not yet been finalized. This is not a mistake. It is a photograph of a text in the making. And when we place these fragments back into their historical context, A broader picture is beginning to emerge. We live in a rapidly changing world. Empires are collapsing. Others are being built. Languages meet. Traditions influence each other. Texts circulate before being codified. This is not an anomaly. That's how history normally works. But this normal functioning, this creates tension with the narrative of an immediate fixation, perfectly finished from the beginning. This is where the experts begin to speak, cautiously, in specialist publications, with measured vocabulary. They are not talking about a revolution. They are talking about reassessment. They don't talk about contradiction. They are talking about increased complexity. But the message is there. These manuscripts suggest that the foundational text underwent a longer period of development, plus progressive, than what the summarized tradition suggests. Academic conferences are taking it up. Presentations are given. Debates are emerging, not in front of the cameras, but in conference rooms. Reactions are mixed. Some researchers welcome this data as a confirmation of what they had long suspected. Others are expressing caution. They highlight the limitations of the methods. They insist on the need to avoid overinterpretation. And they are right, because science progresses slowly. But one thing is becoming difficult to deny. These fragments exist. They are dated. They are being analyzed. And they don't integrate perfectly within the dominant narrative framework. This is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of chronology. From there, the debate is changing in nature. It's no longer a question of knowing whether or not we accept these results. It's about understanding what they imply. Because while the text has undergone a phase of gradual stabilization, so that means his story is more human, more contextual, more dynamic. And that's disturbing, not because it weakens the spiritual message, but because it shifts the authority. Authority no longer rests solely based on a fixed narrative, but on a historical process. This is where the resistance becomes more visible, not in the form of a direct refutation, but in the form of a diversion. Emphasis is placed on the margins of error. The importance of the fragments is put into perspective. It is important to remember that the core message remains unchanged. All of this is true, but that doesn't answer the central question. Why has this data been ignored for so long? In mainstream narratives? Why are they still absent? Numerous syntheses? At this stage, even the most cautious researchers acknowledge one thing. There has been simplification, not out of malice, but for the sake of clarity. However, the true story is rarely clear. It is made of layers, of transitions, of compromise. And when this reality emerges, it forces us to reconsider deeply held beliefs. It was precisely at that moment that the investigation crosses a threshold, because what was still debatable now becomes a structuring element. The pieces of the puzzle are coming together. Registrations, currencies, the manuscripts. They all say the same thing. Not a sudden break, but a gradual construction. And that's where everything changes. Because once this part is added, the entire image changes. Now that all the pieces are put together, something new is appearing. Not an isolated theory, not a provocation, but a coherent image. An image that is not based on a single source, nor on a bold interpretation, but on the convergence of independent disciplines. Archaeology, linguistic, history, religious comparison. Each one brings a fragment, and together they paint a more nuanced picture. In this reconstruction, the chronology does not disappear. It is transforming. The founding events retain their central place, Revelation remains the spiritual point of origin. But around this core, the historical process appears to be more extensive. Oral transmission plays a vital role. Memorization, the recitation, community rehearsal, then gradually putting it in writing, not in a single gesture, but in stages, fragments, various media, similar versions, but not identical. Over time, a need is being felt. Clarifier, unify, stabilizer. This need is not solely religious, it is also political. Because as the community grows, that the territories expand, that languages diversify, a shared text becomes a tool for cohesion. Archaeology confirms this dynamic. The earliest religious inscriptions show a still flexible terminology. The formulas become clearer over time. The references become more explicit. Currencies follow the same trend. At first, the symbols are discrete. Then, the titles are fixed. Expressions are becoming more uniform. This is not a breakup. It's a maturation process. Linguistics, too, tells this story. The grammatical variations observed in ancient manuscripts. These are not mistakes. They bear witness to a living text in circulation before his full canonization, a phenomenon well known to specialists, because Islam is not an exception in religious history. When compared with other traditions, the parallel becomes obvious. Judaism, with the long fixing of his texts, Christianity, with its councils, its debates, its successive canons. No great tradition is born instantly and permanently fixed. They are all going through a period of construction. What modern archaeology suggests, therefore, it is not an anomaly, but a historical normality. So why was this story simplified? The answer lies less in bad faith than in the function of the narrative. A foundational narrative must be reassuring. It must unite. He must communicate clearly. The historical complexity, it weakens this function because it introduces nuances, transitions, areas of uncertainty. However, institutions, both religious and political, they rarely have an interest in emphasizing uncertainty. So who decides on the story? Often, these are the ones who write the summaries. Those who teach, those who codify, not necessarily to deceive, but to simplify. When the community reaches a critical size, when authority needs to be centralized, when the unit becomes a priority. For what? Because a stable narrative allows for transmission. But this process also involves choices. What is retained? That which is ruled out. That which is relegated to the margins, not abruptly removed, but gradually forgotten. This is where the initial mechanism resurfaces. You remember Galileo, the Darwin, from Champollion. Each time, the truth does not destroy the existing world. It simply forces us to rethink it. And each time, resistance does not stem from a lack of evidence, but out of fear of the consequences. Recognizing a more complex story does not mean giving up on faith. This means accepting that faith is part of a human story, that the texts, before being consecrated, have been transmitted, preserved, structured by men. This observation does not detract from their spiritual significance, but he shifts his gaze. He invites us to distinguish the message and its historical trajectory. And it is precisely this distinction which remains difficult to accept, because it takes away from the monopoly of interpretation. She gives back to history its right to complexity. At this stage of the investigation, the table is now legible. The evidence converges. They don't scream. They are not arguing. They show a gradual construction, a step-by-step fixation, a standardization motivated by specific contexts. Nothing scandalous, Nothing exceptional, but something profoundly human. And perhaps that's it, which is the most disturbing. Because accepting this complete image, it requires a certain amount of intellectual courage. That of inhabiting discomfort. The one about looking at history without trying to simplify it, but all truth revealed. It comes at a price. When a truth begins to emerge, history shows that it never spreads without resistance. And it's rarely abstract ideas. Who pay the highest price? These are the people, the researchers, those who did not seek to provoke, but simply to understand. For some, the consequence was slow in coming, almost invisible. A career that has plateaued, promotions that never happen, invitations that cease, no sudden break, just stagnation. For others, the price was more direct. Ignored work. Publications cited less and less. Solid contributions nonetheless, which are gradually disappearing from major bibliographies. Not refuted, simply bypassed. And then, there are subtle pressures. A kind colleague who advises caution. A department head who suggests changing the angle. An editor who recommends reformulating certain conclusions. Nothing illegal, nothing explicit, but a clear message. This is a sensitive area. Because tampering with the story of origins, it is never a neutral gesture. Even when we talk about ancient history, the repercussions are contemporary. When this work leaves the academic sphere, a different dynamic is emerging, that of public debate. And then, complexity has little place. The media simplify. A title replaces a nuance. A hypothesis becomes a certainty. A methodological discussion becomes a supposed attack. Controversies are raging. Some are crying provocation. Others are into manipulation. Very few people take the time to read. And in the middle, the original message is lost. Because what these researchers are actually saying is neither spectacular nor destructive. They don't say, it's all false. They say, it's more complex. But complexity is unsettling. Then deliberate misunderstandings arise. These works are being blamed to want to weaken the faith. They are believed to have political intentions. They are associated with ideological camps, which they never claimed. It's an old strategy. Discredit the messenger too. Avoid examining the message. And yet, the implications of this research extend far beyond the academic sphere. Because it's a question of identity, the way millions of people understand their history, the way in which a community tells the story of its origins. However, identity is built on a simplified narrative, can become fragile when it encounters the complexity of reality. It is also a question of power, that of defining the legitimate framework for discourse. Who has the right to speak about the past? Who decides what is taught? Who sets the limits of acceptable interpretation? These questions are not only relevant to Islam, they are found in all societies. Finally, it's a question of collective memory. What we choose to remember, what we prefer to forget. Memory is never a simple recording of the past. It is a construction. And like any construction, it reflects choices. That is why this investigation concerns us today. Because we live in a world where the narratives clash, where certainties clash, where nuance is often perceived as a weakness. Now, because scientific tools have never been so precise, because access to sources has never been so widespread, and yet the temptation to simplify remains strong. Personally, because each of us is faced with a silent choice, that of repeating a comfortable narrative or to accept a more demanding story. Accepting the truth not always be where you expect it. What to understand does not mean to deny. What to question, that is not betrayal. The researchers who dared to follow the evidence to the very end, they paid a price, sometimes heavy, but their work left a mark, because a substantiated truth may be delayed, minimized, deformed, but it rarely disappears. It's circulating. She reappeared. She's waiting for her moment. And yet, despite all this, the truth keeps resurfacing. Having reached this point in the investigation, a question arises. What have we actually learned? Not just on history, but about ourselves, on our relationship with the truth, at the same time, and the intellectual courage that this requires. Because this investigation was never intended to provoke. She never sought to create opposition. She tried to understand. And understanding often begins with a fundamental confusion that must be dispelled. The truth is not an attack. To say that history is complex does not mean that it is a lie. Recognizing a human process does not detract from the spiritual dimension. On the contrary, history is not blasphemy. It is the framework within which faith takes place. The texts do not appear outside of time. They traverse different contexts, languages, companies. To study them, it's about restoring their depth. And understand has never meant to destroy. To understand, it's about rejecting reassuring simplifications. When they can no longer withstand the facts, it is accepting that the truth may be more demanding than the story that has been passed down to us. You remember the question asked at the beginning, what's going on? When a truth threatens an entire civilization? History has answered us. She is initially rejected, then marginalized, and sometimes she eventually became integrated. Not because she triumphs, but because she persists. This is where your role becomes essential. Because this investigation does not end with this video. It continues in the manner which you choose to listen to reflect, to transmit. The viewer is not passive. By choosing to stay this long, you have already done something rare. You have embraced complexity. You rejected the caricature. You admitted that one can love a tradition without freezing it in an unrealistic image. The duty of critical thinking is not a luxury reserved for academics. It is a collective responsibility, because simplified narratives can unite in the short term, but they weaken in the long term. An identity that cannot withstand scrutiny becomes vulnerable to fear, to instrumentalization, at closing time. Conversely, an identity capable of integrating its real history becomes stronger, plus mature, more free. And this freedom is what we pass on to future generations. Not a perfect story, but a method. The one that consists of saying, here is what we know, here's how we know, and this is what we continue to search for. Because transmission is not only a question of content, it's a question of attitude. Teaching our children what questions to ask is not treason. Doubting is not the same as denying. Faith and reason are not enemies, but complementary. Perhaps this is it, the most valuable legacy of this investigation. Not a definitive conclusion, but an invitation. Looking back without fear. To accept that the truth never gives itself up all at once, that it requires time, patience, and sometimes the courage to go against the grain. Because the most important truths, these are not the ones that confirm what we already know. These are the things that force us to grow up. So, if this investigation has made an impression on you, if you feel that these complex truths deserve to be heard, so subscribe. Because some ideas do not survive that if someone dares to listen to them,